Last year, a legendary YouTube atheist Paul Enns, who's better known as Paulogia, published something of a response to Gary Habermas in response to Habermas's minimal witness hypothesis for the resurrection. On this episode of the BLOGCAST, we're going to be looking at that argument that he makes there, and we're going to see if it can stand up to scrutiny. So hang in there while the title card rolls. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I am Triggerman 1976, and welcome back to the BLOGCAST. If this is your first time tuning in, please be sure and smash that like button. If you're a returning viewer and you aren't already subscribed to the channel, please be sure and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you'll know whenever new content goes live. Also, do not forget that you can follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976, links to which are found in the link tree in the description below, along with links to all of my content, and includes a link to Amazon to purchase a copy of my debut action thriller, A Turning of Shadow. In today's video, we're going to be looking at an article that was penned by atheist YouTuber Paulogia, who's also known as Paul Enns. And he published this article over at Bart Ehrman's blog. Now, let me begin by saying that Paul's article was thoughtful, it was well written, and he obviously had put a lot of effort and a lot of thought into it. But my question is, can it stand up to scrutiny? I should point out that I'm not the first to respond to this, but as a commenter on my blog had apparently seen either Paulogia's video or had seen mentions of it on Twitter and had not seen any responses to it. So I'll be sure to link to one of the better responses below as well. In his article, Paul is responding to the outline of a hypothesis that's generally been promoted by Gary Habermas, and it's really given legs in the first volume of his 4-volume magnum opus on the resurrection. Now, the first volume came out in January of 2024, and the second didn't hit shelves until September of that same year. Third volume, which contains notes, is expected in May of 2025, and volume 4, well, that has a to be announced date on it. One of the inevitable problems with writing response to a multi-volume work is that some of the objections one raises or arguments that one might make could potentially be refuted when the second or third or even the fourth volume hits. So it's usually a good idea to exercise some patience. But Paul, as usual, he just throws caution to the wind and dives headlong into the argument. Let me also say that I do have volumes 1 and 2 of the set, but what I'll be offering here are what I believe are answers or responses to what Paul raises in his article. So it's not going to be based on anything that's found in any of Habermas's work, but it's based on what just the average person would find out there in the sphere. Also, as a note, I will not be responding to all of Paul's points in this video. Rather, I will highlight what I believe are some of the more relevant or more controversial claims or hypotheses. However, he presents them as hypotheses. But I do have a full response to this written up at the blog, the link to which is in the description below as well. So, with that being said, in his first full paragraph, Paul gives us kind of the broad strokes for his article where he writes, toward the end of the recently released 1,000-page first volume of his Resurrection Evidence tome, Habermas contends that there is a lack of scholars who are willing to embrace and defend a single naturalistic hypothesis to explain early beliefs in the resurrection of Jesus, preferring a general shotgun approach that basically presents several alternatives where the critic can switch back and forth between the options if one or two become problematic in the aftermath of the ensuing discussion. Few skeptical champions are standing up apparently due to the strength of the contrary data. Now he continues and he gives credit to his host Bart Ehrman by citing Ehrman's book How Jesus Became God. It may not behoove prominent academics to focus on promoting specific pet theories in lieu of prioritizing broader, more fundamental principles of their field. As Dr. Ehrman notes, any other scenario, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred. I regularly find such allegations are often very revealing about the necessary presuppositions about which one is speaking. After all, there's a question that arises from a historical perspective, namely, what can we actually know about the resurrection? The whole question in regard to the phrase historical perspective should alert us to the question of the purpose of history, which is to tell us what happened. Sometimes history can tell us causation, but sometimes that issue is even debatable amongst historical sources. And it depends on whether or not we are willing to trust our sources or their access to particular events. But if we say we don't trust a particular source, it necessarily makes one suspect if they're willing to believe other similar sources, either in terms of content or presentation. But this isn't about the historical method per se, as much as it is about whether or not people can interact with them in a consistent or coherent manner. Enns offers, in response to Habermas's challenge, 12 hypotheses, which he calls the minimal witness hypothesis, which he describes as relatively uncontroversial naturalistic events that in turn gave rise to the Jesus movement, which eventually evolved into modern Christianity. Now, as I've previously stated, I will not go through all 12. Rather, I intend to just pick out a few that I believe to be the most relevant and focus on them. One thing I will do is I will give praise to Paul in the fact that he does affirm the fact that Jesus is a historical person. That way he doesn't sound like a complete loon. So, with that, let's look at the hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. In the early first century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I'm not exactly sure whether we should consider this an actual hypothesis or simply just a historical admission. That can either be taken or left as it is, but what he says afterwards, that's where the issue comes in. The Dead Sea Scrolls, along with Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, and the wealth of apocalyptic literature like First Enoch, Fourth Ezra, Second Baruch, Jubilees, and Daniel, tells us that Jewish apocalypticism and apocalyptic preachers such as John the Baptist, Judas of Galilee, and Theudas were not uncommon in first century Judea. The problem is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as the other mentioned texts of First Enoch, Fourth Ezra, and etc., are mostly second to first century BC texts. Josephus and Philo are rough contemporaries not only of Jesus but of the early church. If anything, Philo can be considered roughly indicative of Second Temple Jewish beliefs that often feed into how Jesus is perceived post resurrection. So, in some sense, this statement can best be described as misleading at worst or unclear at best. But however one takes it, it could be considered, at least technically, uncontroversial. Easy enough? But this sets up for his second hypothesis. This Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on the cross, a common practice at the time, of which Paul writes. While the infraction could have been anything, actions ascribed to Jesus, such as disturbing the peace in the temple or challenging Roman authority by claiming to be the Messiah or King of the Jews, would have been sufficient to warrant death penalty under Roman rule. Yeah. Here again, we run into a problem as this could be described as either misleading or overly simplistic. Because while it was true that the Roman government of Judea actually committed the deed, they only acted at the behest of the Jewish authorities. In fact, this is what our primary historical sources contend. You know those historic primary sources? The Gospels. And it's from this hypothesis that N springs to assert his third hypothesis. The resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers. And he asks this: apologists often focus on the timing of Jesus' body removal, but the crucial question is who disposed of it? Paul appeals to a few sources to establish a number of assertions regarding the possible disposal of the body of Jesus. My chief complaint is that Enns is horrible at citing his sources. So I am left to resort to the primary sources, the Gospels, to establish the facts. What do they say? Well, Matthew 25:57 to 61 notes that at least three people, all of whom are identified as disciples, knew where he was buried. Similarly, Mark 15:42 to 47 identifies at least four, while Luke 23:49 indicates there was a contingent of acquaintances who not only saw him die, but also identifies some of the group as being witnesses to the location of his interment. John 19:38 and following pointedly identifies two figures as not only being responsible for his burial, but also for securing his body for such. So we have four sources, all early, which contradict the claim. Of course, the response might be, well, that there's an alleged relationship between some of the sources, specifically the synoptics, that potentially whittles down the sources to two. But as it says in 2 Corinthians 13:1, every matter must be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. In order to overcome the evidence from our primary sources, the Gospels, it is contingent upon the person making the claim to provide direct testimonial evidence to the contrary, not just appeal to practices or norms or whatever. They have to provide actual documentary evidence to the facts. You cannot appeal to any practices or appeal to or make inference from those supposed policies. It is necessary to prevent direct evidence that addresses the claim. Our historical documentary evidence stands in the way of such a hypothesis, so we have to move on to possible psychological ones. This is important. Now, I just finished up a video on cognitive dissonance. You can check that out here. Paul goes a different route, specifically to the issue of bereavement hallucinations, which forms the basis of his fifth hypothesis. Distraught after the death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus appeared to him. Now, about this, Paul writes: while potential causes are innumerable, a post bereavement hallucinatory experience, PBHE, involving sensory perceptions of a deceased loved one is likely a cause of Peter's mistaken belief. Estimated to affect 30 to 60% of bereaved individuals during their grieving process, PBHEs can manifest through various sensory modalities, including visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory sensations, and may present as dreams, vivid memories, or hallucinations. PBHEs are common among grieving individuals and do not necessarily indicate mental illness. I appreciate the fact that he says bereavement hallucinations aren't necessarily an indicator of mental illness. But this is an allegation that I've tackled before in this particular blog post, which will be linked below. But specifically, I note in that blog post, first we have to deal with Luke's prologue, which makes reference to eyewitnesses. The author is clearly not a witness to the events, but is admitting to operating on the basis of witness testimony. Furthermore, if one takes the historical position that Mark's gospel is composed on the basis of the testimony of the Apostle Peter, it can also be considered as a witness. Lastly, John's gospel ends on a testimonial of eyewitness authority. We also have to address the inherent bias present in such a contention as bereavement hallucination. Namely, it's anti-supernaturalistic. Furthermore, the fact there are significant differences in events based on age and sex. For example, bereavement hallucinations mostly affect young widows between the ages of 30 and 39, and specifically those over 70 years of age are most likely to experience such hallucinations. Also, such hallucinations only appear to present when the object is a spouse, a child, or a close relative. In fact, half of all reported incidents of bereavement hallucination involve a subject's spouse, while the other half involve a child or some other close relative. There are a few documented instances involving remarkably close friends, especially among those who suffer from extreme loneliness or isolation, and most often occur at specific times, usually around bedtime. In light of those facts, an appeal to bereavement hallucination is an insufficient hypothesis due to the fact that Peter is number one, male, he's not of the appropriate age for the experience, and his relationship with his teacher wouldn't fall into an appropriate category. And this is based on Paul's own source. The final hypothesis we're going to look at in the video has to do with the issue of guilty conscience, which forms the basis of Ian's eighth hypothesis. Paul, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of a sincere belief that he was serving God, experienced a non veridical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus. To support this, he writes, Paul's persecution of Christians may well have caused him profound guilt and cognitive dissonance. This psychological distress, possibly resembling post-traumatic stress disorder, could have triggered a psychotic break manifesting as a vision of the resurrected Jesus. Paul's subsequent conversion to Christianity may have served as a coping mechanism to resolve his inner turmoil, alleviate guilt, and find new purpose in life. The problem with such contention simply doesn't follow. Why is this? Well, first of all, Saul was a zealous Jew who was persecuting Jews who believed were abandoning the faith and was in a circle where his own beliefs were evidently unassailable because this is where his identity was founded as a person in the ancient Near East. Moreover, as a Jew fixed in such a community, there would be built in resistance, even hostile resistance to any change whatsoever, as stability was the standard, not novelty. This fact alone, as a social reality, further demonstrates the necessary resistance to Jesus' message in his life, much less in regard to any association after such a stigmatized death. In other words, Paul, before his conversion to Christ, would have felt absolutely no guilt or shame for what he was doing because what he was doing was morally justified. Furthermore, the accusation of post traumatic stress disorder is dependent upon experiences defined by personal trauma and is usually correlated with pre existing anxiety disorders or tendencies. And furthermore, the symptoms of PTSD include, but are not limited to, destructive and self destructive behavior, memory loss, hypervigilance, and sometimes an exaggerated startle response, none of which are evident in the material we have present. In other words, for this hypothesis to be true, one has to ignore all manner of psychosocial realities that were present in the dyadic, honor-based culture of the ancient Near East and treat Paul like a modern Western individualist. When it comes to attempting to explain the origins of Christianity apart from the supernatural reality of the bodily resurrection of Jesus, we find there are significant obstacles to overcome. Often these include appeals to psychological phenomena such as bereavement hallucinations or cognitive dissonance. And they often fail because they do not understand the criteria necessary to establish such a condition. And when such a criteria is consistently applied, it has to ignore significant historical data to maintain the contention. Moreover, when proceeding from a historical point of view, we see it's often by ignoring the data that one can attempt to counter the reality of the resurrection as a historical event. The application of such highly selective bias criteria actually winds up undermining essentially all pre-modern historical inquiry. If anything, such attempts to attack the reality of the resurrection as a historical event prove that in order to deny it, one fundamentally undermines any meaningful approach to history as a scientific endeavor. Well, that's all for this episode of the BLOGCAST. If you enjoyed it, please be sure and smash that like button. And if you found it interesting, please share it with your friends. And if you aren't subscribed, please be sure and hit that subscribe button. Finally, links to the original article that this video is based on, as well as all of the mentioned content, are linked in the description below. And don't forget that you can follow me on X and Instagram at Sugarman1976. And until the next video, friends, God bless.